Hi, thank you for tuning into this. This is the first of a two-part video interview panel series that we're doing focused on 6 months out from the events of August 11th and 12th. So our first panel is going to be looking at the Dean's Working Group that was formed pretty soon after the events of August 11th and 12th that was intended to help the university recover from those traumatic events and then also figure out how do we move forward. Tomorrow we'll also be conducting a panel interview with student leaders from several different organizations that were involved in the student response to the events of this past summer, and we'll also be finding out what's in store for this semester as well. I'm Tim Dodson, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Cavalier Daily, and today we're joined by Risa Goluboff, who's the dean of the law school, and also Brendan Nigro, who is a third-year college student, and he's also a member of I have to make sure I have the words correct on this one, the Advisory Committee on the Future of the Historic Landscape. So I'm going to let both of them introduce themselves a little bit, give their background, and also talk about the groups that they're involved with.
So my name is Brendan Nigro. I'm a third-year college student, history major, and one of the 3 student members on the Advisory Committee for the Future of the Historic Landscape. That is an advisory committee to the Dean's Working Group, composed of 9 members. Those 3 student members are me, Tia Latif, who's the director of the Multicultural Student Center, and Victoria Tucker, who's a double who nursing student and very involved in the Young Alumni Council. Beyond that, there's 6 sort of professionals on the advisory committee as well, trying to kind of draw from different interests, different belief systems, and also kind of different modes of thinking. So one really good example of that is the Pasadena of the Architecture School, Liz Meyer, is on the committee, has really helped us with ideas of spatial thinking with the historic landscape. Gary Gallagher, head of the now Civil War History Center here at UVA. The 2 co-chairs are Professor Claudrina Harold of African American Studies and History, and President Emeritus John Castine. Our 2 other members are former rector of the board, I believe, George Martin, and Sherry Winston, who is for some time the Rotunda manager here. So kind of broad range of interests. I'm one of just 9 members, so hopefully I'll be able to represent the advisory committee well today. But I'll hand it over to Dean Goluboff now.
Hi, I'm Dean Risa Goluboff. I'm the dean of the law school and also the chair of the Dean's Working Group. I think that's probably good. I'll say for the benefit of if we're going to talk about the advisory committee at all, I'm also a historian as well as being a lawyer, so I have a appointment in the history department. I have an appointment in the Woodson Institute for African American African Studies, and I have an appointment in the Miller Center. So I've got a lot of appointments around grounds, and now I'm chairing the response, the Dean's Working Group response.
So we're 6 months out. Actually, today is the 6-month marker since the events of August 11th, in which we had white supremacist groups hold a torchlit march through our grounds. And the Dean's Working Group was formed pretty quickly after those events. And so, I know that there was the preliminary report or some documents that were released in September. And I know there's been I think there was a presentation to Student Council. So there's been some public engagement around this. But where is the Dean's Working Group at this moment? Sort of what progress has it made throughout this semester? And then also going to the Historic Landscape Committee, sort of when was that group formed and sort of what was the purpose of it? So maybe both of you could speak to that, but we'll start with the Dean's Working Group.
Sure. So when we were formed, we understood our charge to have 3 different parts. The first part was about safety and security in the direct aftermath of August 11th. The second part was about making sure that we are living our values as an institution, values of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, very different values from those that were on display by the white supremacists. And then the third was thinking about how, as a university, the second is really about how we as a community react, and then the third is how, as a university community in particular, that has the capacity to discover new knowledge and teach and do research, how do we lead out of this moment, right? We didn't choose for this to happen here. I think we all would have preferred it didn't happen anywhere, and didn't happen here, but now that it's happened, how do we make meaning out of it in the way that we do as a university, which is to think about research agendas and pedagogy. So we started out with the first, with safety and security, and as you say, we produced an evaluation of what happened and what we could have done better, and made some recommendations out of that. I think we've made a lot of progress there. That was our first priority. And we made 2 policy recommendations that have already happened. One was strengthening the open flames policy of the university, making sure that information was given from environmental and health and safety to the police departments so that they could enforce the open safety rule, the open flame rules, and the board made that into a regulation, not just a policy, at its meeting in September. Second was having the academical village designated as a facility, which would prohibit firearms from outsiders as well as insiders. The third piece is one we're still working on, the third policy recommendation, which are time, place, and manner policies. As a university, we are deeply committed to free speech and the free exchange of ideas, and at the same time, we are deeply committed to protecting the safety of our grounds, the safety of all the members of our community, and there are constitutionally allowable policies that one can put into place to better create safety and free speech simultaneously. And so we've been working on that, and there's actually going to be a roundtable this Wednesday at 5 p.m. to get student input on a draft policy that we're going to be releasing publicly next week and start to be able to talk about. In addition, Margolis Healy, the external safety and security experts, did their review and have made a number of recommendations. We've met with them as well as with Tim Hafey and the administration to talk about what those recommendations look like and how we can be helpful in implementing them. But a number of them are already begun to be implemented. So increasing the number of community relations police officers, creating a new person to whom all the safety and security units in the university will report. Also, there's been movement toward increased trainings for police officers. I think those have already begun. We're continuing to work on that. So I think a lot has happened in that space, and then separate from that, on the how we live our values, I'll let Brendan talk about the advisory committee. But our thought there was, the Board of Visitors removed the Confederate plaques from the rotunda in the September board meeting, and they charged the Dean's Working Group with recommending what to do with them. And it seemed to the Dean's Working Group that the answer to that question should be based in larger principles, not just about those Confederate plaques, but how do we think about the historic landscape more generally. And the Dean's Working Group is not quite the right group to do that. We don't have the kind of expertise that the advisory committee we created has. We don't have the kind of representation across grounds on every level that we created in the advisory committee. And so we're looking forward to getting their report and then thinking about how to pass that on to the board. And then finally, we've been working on, one other piece in the kind of how we live our values is we're working on a climate survey, which we're going to hopefully do this spring. And then there will be more process after that once we have more information to talk about what are the steps that need to be taken given the information that we learn there. And the final piece has been thinking about long-term investments. I presented to the board a draft proposal. We're still working through that, figuring out, what are the pieces that should be done immediately? What are the pieces we're in a presidential transition that need to wait for the new president? So that was a really long answer. I apologize, but that's where we stand.
So in terms of the advisory committee, I would say the Dean's Working Group did a fantastic job creating this committee and having it be one that is diverse in interest and belief. And we've kind of seen our role in those latter 2 ideas that Dean Goluboff spoke of. So this idea of living our values as a community, but also kind of advancing and furthering knowledge. So the advisory committee is really committed to acknowledging that the University of Virginia, since its very inception, has been a living and learning environment, and that it ought to be our hope that any action to the historic landscape is done through a pedagogical lens, that regardless of the decisions we make with additions, removals, contextualization, there should always be an inclination towards teaching and towards furthering knowledge. So that's kind of been one of the main goals of the advisory committee. In terms of where the advisory committee stands now, we had a few meetings before winter break. We came back, we had a public input session, which was pretty well attended, about 52 attendees, I believe. And we garnered public input, and we're in our drafting cycle right now, so hopefully we'll have a report actually by February 15th, so this coming week, to present to the Dean's Working Group. they'll take those principles that Dean Goluboff spoke of and hopefully craft them into recommendations and just help us think about the historic landscape more broadly. So the recommendations and principles are meant to be broad, but also within those sort of broad principles allow kind of interpretation of where these principles hit the ground and how the Dean's Working Group can interpret them to create substantive actions for the community. And so the charge of the committee is really to think about the visible historic symbols on ground. So it's not so much about naming, but more about plaques, markers, statues across grounds and how they reflect the imperfections and achievements of the university throughout its 200-year history.
So I don't know if you can speak to the specifics of that, because you said the report still needs to be presented to the Dean's Working Group, but are you able to to tell us anything concrete that might come out of the advisory committee?
So I would say one thing that the advisory committee as a whole is very in favor of is this idea of due diligence and process. In these changes to the historic landscape, there should be, we think, a kind of consistent chance for community input. That's not to say that the board's decision of removing the Confederate plaques, one that was very swift and well done, it's not to say that there always needs to be multiple public input hearings before. It's just to say that there should be an acknowledgement that there are broader stakeholders in play, including university students, faculty, and staff, as well as the Charlottesville community as a whole, and the way they interact with this historic landscape. So that is the one thing that will, I believe, come out of this report. Another one will be this idea of sort of multi-layered interpretation. So a good example of that would be, for example, Maury Hall. The name of Maury Hall, I'm not sure on the first name, I don't know if you know, but Maury was a Confederate soldier. He was also a brilliant oceanographer. But there's lots of things that have happened at that building over the years, including in 1969 and 70, significant protests over the ROTC program at UVA. And so throughout the university's history, each of these spaces have a unique history and one that has incredible nuance. And so we're trying to think critically about how we can best sort of expose those histories and again, use the historic landscape as a sort of pedagogical tool. Our hope is that in all of our recommendations that we'll be kind of promoting the pursuit of knowledge, as is the university's general mission.
And then as for the Dean's Working Group, thinking ahead to this semester, I know there's going to be consideration and discussion of potential time, place, manner policies. Is there anything else like kind of concrete that you could give us a preview of for this semester? Maybe things would go to the Board of Visitors, for example, for action.
So yeah, the time, place, and manner is a big one, in addition, there's the climate survey, as I mentioned, the report of the advisory committee coming to us on February 15th, the board meets about 2 weeks after that. So there's a question whether we'll be ready as a Dean's Working Group to make a presentation about the advisory committee's work. 2 weeks would be pretty quick turnaround. It's possible that we'll be able to, but if not, we'll hope to do that at the next board meeting later in the spring. But that would be our hope. So what we have on tap right now is further development of the investment committee, the long-term investment proposals. We've been working with the administration to think about the budgets for those and to continue talking within the Dean's Working Group about them, the climate survey and the advisory committee. So I think those are the three big, plus the time, place, and manner.
So in the time since, I think we did an interview, I think in September maybe, it was you, me, and Brianna. And so in the time since then, there's a little bit more of a specific question. So Charlottesville conducted an independent review through former U.S. Attorney Tim Hafey and his team of lawyers, I think at Hunt & Williams. And so they looked at the events of this past summer from July 8th through August 12th. And so when they were evaluating University Police Department's response to August 11th. Their report it's pretty critical of the UPD. It calls it woefully inadequate. And it's critical of the university not, coordinating with other groups and accepting mutual offers of assistance or aid. I don't think that came out in the report that came out from the Dean's Working Group in September. And so I want to ask you, does the Dean's Working Group have what's its response to the independent report that came out from Charlottesville? And do you agree with their assessment of the situation as it unfolded?
So I think for the most part, the Heafey report, the conclusions about the university and August 11th, which were only a small part of their 220-page report, which was mostly about the city on August 12th. But I think that for the most part, what they found was very much in agreement with what we found. We had found that there was a lack of intelligence beforehand, and then the intelligence that the university had wasn't acted on as effectively as it could have been, and that a lot of it had to do, and I think the Heafey report finds this too, with the framework within which the university, the city, law enforcement were operating, which was one of protecting free speech and not fully appreciating the nature of the events that were about to unfold. Whether they should have more fully appreciated or not, I think they didn't. So I think there's a lot of correspondence there, and I give President Sullivan credit for creating the Dean's Working Group and enabling us to produce a report pretty quickly that's obviously a lot smaller, but came to very similar conclusions. On the cooperation point, I think he and his team had a much broader bandwidth, a much broader perspective, because they were speaking to all the different police forces involved, whereas we really only spoke to UPD and the people within the university. And my sense is that there was cooperation and there was communication, but that UPD's understanding of what its needs were informed by this framework of protected speech, and so though they knew there was assistance available, I think maybe they didn't call on it in the way they might have had they fully appreciated what was about to unfold. I do think the Dean's Working Group had a meeting recently with where Tim Heafey presented his recommendations, including that one, and as well as I mentioned this before, as well as Stephen Healy, who was the person from Margolis Healy who took the lead on the external safety and security review, members of the administration and the Dean's Working Group, so that we could integrate Heafey's report with the Healy report and our understanding. And certainly, I think that in the future there will be more cooperation. My sense is that there are really good relationships between the various police departments in the area, but that they hadn't necessarily had specific training on how do you collaborate in an instance like this one. And so I think that in the future there will be more targeted training to respond to these kinds of events.
And one more specific question about the timeline that came out in September, and some of the preliminary findings that were released. Do you foresee the Dean's Working Group publishing like a revised or updated report at some point in the future, just with all the information that's come out over this past 6 months? Like for example, I think the Chronicle of Higher Education, they did a massive FOIA to receive emails from university officials, and they found like there was an email on August 8th from a university police officer to Michael Gibson, who's the chief of university police, warning about the potential of some sort of tiki march, although that didn't come through in the timeline from the Dean's Working Group when that was published in September. Do you see any of that information being revised or updated maybe this semester?
So the timeline that we distributed alongside of our observations and recommendations wasn't one that we produced. The timeline was the UPD's own timeline of events. So we didn't, just so, that's not our complete timeline. Creating a timeline of our own that went beyond that would have been a much larger undertaking, right, in terms of, and would have taken a lot longer. So we're not going to update the UPD's timeline because that's their timeline. That said, I do think that as information has come out, it's been information that we've been talking about, that we've been incorporating into our understanding of what future steps need to be. And, it was always the case that our observations and recommendations were meant to be future looking. So I understand that it might be dissatisfying to have observations out there that don't incorporate new information. But I think it's more important that we incorporate it as we're thinking about next steps, rather than to have a document that keeps evolving. That would be lovely if we had the time to do it.
So we did put a Google form out ahead of the interview just to see if there were any questions from community members, and we've touched on some of the themes and points that some of them were making. One specific question we got, and I don't know the answer to this, so I want to ask. Someone asked, why has there been no input in the working group from victims of the attacks of August 11th and 12th? So I want to get your response to that question.
Sure, I saw that question too. And there actually has been quite a bit of input. So I've had meetings, one-on-one meetings with a number of the people who were there. I've had email exchanges with parents of some of the students who were there. We have had a lot of input. There's always room for more input, and there's this roundtable coming up. There's the input form. I've been very responsive to people who've reached out to me. I've reached out to others individually. So I think there can always be more input, and I'm perfectly open to more input, but it's certainly not the case that there wasn't any. So, and I think that having a voice and having an opportunity to talk about what happened is really important, and I know that recovering from an event like that, when you've been threatened and been a victim there, is really challenging, and so I think some people might want to talk more than others do, and there have been people I've reached out to but haven't heard back from, which is totally okay, and I understand. But if there are those out there who are watching who still want to reach out and talk, I would really like to.
And another specific question we got, and I'm not sure if this falls under the charge of the Dean's Working Group, but it was mentioned in some of the student demands that were being made last semester of the administration, which was about revoking Jason Kessler and Richard Spencer's degrees from UVA for what this question said was violating the honor code and violating principles that maintain our community of trust. So maybe what's your take on that question as well?
So, like the person who wrote that question, I find, and like many, I think it is, it's horrifying that our institution is now connected to people who don't stand for our values and are violent and exclusive and hateful. I don't like that. I think many people don't like that. It's my understanding that the faculty and the faculty senate are the bodies who would revoke a degree. So the Dean's Working Group doesn't have the authority to do that. I think that would lie with the faculty. So it is my understanding that the times when degrees have been revoked, I could be wrong about this, but it's my understanding that it's been for honor code violations while the people were students. And I think it's something that we should think really hard about, whether the university should be in the business of revoking people's degrees for behavior post-graduation where they violate the honor code. Do you want the university policing everyone who lies out there? And I recognize that's there's a wide spectrum, and the behavior on display by Richard Spencer and Jason Kessler, as I said, it was, potentially, in my view, my personal view, not the view of the Dean's Working Group, I think there's potential criminal liability there. And so one could say, if you were going to have such degree revocations, they would be the kind of people. But I would think that you'd want to have the kinds of deliberative principles and recommendations about whether you want to head in that direction that we've thought about on the historic landscape. And I will say, separate and apart from whether the university should be in the business of policing how people are using their degrees or what they do after they've gotten their degrees, I do think that the university is continuing and UPD is continuing to gather evidence and explore potential avenues of policing the behavior that they engaged in, to the extent that it was criminal behavior or violated the policies of the university. So, and one of the things the working group recommended at the beginning was to encourage criminal prosecutions, and President Sullivan did encourage criminal prosecutions, and I don't think those processes are done. So I think that's something to continue to look out for.
And a question for you, Brendan. When we didn't receive any questions specifically about the Historic Landscape Committee through the Google form, but we did, when we reported on the fact that the meeting was going to be happening, and then when we reported on the meeting itself, I think there was some pushback from some readers who are making the argument that UVA, by creating this committee and going through this process, is erasing history. What would you say to that critique that's been made of the advisory committee?
So I think the advisory committee's charge is one that is really looking at how the historic landscape itself communicates the university's history in an effective manner, or not so effective manner. I think this notion of erasure is one that the committee has grappled with significantly, and we're really committed to this idea of pedagogy. Even with the Confederate plaques, with statues, visible historic symbols across the university that are at some points contrary to the university's values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a consideration of how are we using those pieces of the historic landscape to teach about a different time in the university's history, to teach about a different social and political time in the country's history. And so this notion of erasure is one that the advisory committee has grappled with significantly, and heard differing views from our public input session, and also within our committee on what that notion of erasure really means for us. And there's also an idea here that the taking off of the Confederate plaques on the front of the rotunda is in and of itself a historic action, right? So if that historic action can be interpreted, can be displayed, and we can ensure that these plaques are placed in a way that this period of history isn't entirely forgotten, then I think the advisory committee would be pleased with that outcome. So erasure is something that's certainly on our minds. It's something we're considering with removals, any removals that we recommend, and also with contextualization, the way to which history often has hard edges, and is hard to kind of interpret and write one plaque below a statue. So we're very aware of that criticism. We take it very seriously. And we're also committed, though, in having the markers, visible markers of our historic landscape, really be in line, to some extent, with our contemporary values of the university in some way. So it's a difficult question. It's one that's taken significant deliberation from our external avenues. We have a public input page on the Dean's Working Group website, and we also have talked about it significantly internally. So erasure is something that's being talked about a lot in Charlottesville, being talked about within the advisory committee. But one thing I think that's important to note is actually, I don't think you made it out to the public input session, but Cavalier was represented there, and all the committee members on the advisory committee were incredibly pleased with the way those were civil conversations where disagreement was not only accepted but really embraced, and we had some really great outcomes from that meeting. From all different avenues of the university. So there were multiple alums that came back. There were people from the university library system. Students were there. Faculty were there. So we were really excited the way to which civic discourse was embraced at that public input meeting. And I think that speaks to the university's commitment towards grappling with these questions in a civil and really intensive way. So I don't think I have a definitive answer on how to really answer that critique. I think that's something that historians across the United States are grappling with right now, with these ideas of Confederate statues, but statues of all different eras and markers that really aren't in line with the contemporary values of the university and the nation. So that's a question that's broader, I think, than I can really give as just one member of the advisory committee. But I think my best answer would be that the advisory committee is committed to grappling with that issue.
So one last question for both of you. So here we are 6 months out, reflecting on the events of August 11th and 12th and the impact it's had on the university, Charlottesville community. I mean, it's had a national impact as well. To each of you, what do you think the most significant impact has been of the events? And maybe, it's a broad question, but what is the most significant impact of the events of August 11th and 12th? And how do you think the actors involved have handled it, whether that's the university administration, students, community members, want your take on that.
I think that's a difficult question for me to answer in my role as a member of the advisory committee on the future of the historic landscape. I will say on a more personal level, as a student of the university, to me that has been the biggest impact, the impact on our students, particularly students of targeted communities, and the ways in which the university has sought to seek redress for those events, but also to kind of make sure community members feel safe. So another one of my roles is as a resident advisor, and that I think has been the most impactful way for me to really be involved with the events of August 11th and 12th and making sure my 22 residents felt like they had a home at the university and felt safe in this community, and made sure that they were aware that the community itself is one that embraces diverse backgrounds and perspectives. So I don't think I have a great broad level answer for you, but that would be my take, that I think students are kind of the ones that I think had the most impact in these events.
I don't know if it's possible to have a single broad level answer. No, I mean it. I mean, I think that the events had very different kinds of impacts on lots of different people, and you think obviously of Heather Heyer and her mother, and the others who were injured on August 12th, as well as those who were injured emotionally as well as physically on August 11th. And those are very real consequences and very personal ones, right? So not on a big level, but I think that as a community, we're all responding to the violation of what happened here. I was talking to an alumnus the other day, and he said literally when he watched what was happening on grounds, he wanted to throw up. And he said, I imagine that's how a lot of our alumni felt, and I think it was a very personal violation, especially for the people who were present, but for lots of other people who felt that way. And I think that it has been channeled pretty much at every level of the university into productive activity and watching. You know, we have on the website a list of events that have occurred and that are going to occur that are related to questions of August 11th directly or related more broadly to issues of inclusion and equity and diversity and belonging, and it's a lot of events, and a lot of them are, you know, from students up, coming out of student organizations, they're coming out of faculty. The Woodson Institute has a whole new series right now. You know, at the law school, we just had an event commemorating the first African-American student, right? So President Sullivan at that event announced the creation of a follow-on commission to the President's Commission on Slavery in the University, which is going to be a commission on the university in the age of segregation. And so I think it has galvanized a huge response. I don't think that means that the initial recovery of the violations and of the hatred is gone. I think people are still recovering from that, and at the same time, it is really energizing and inspiring to see how so many people across the university, from at all levels, have said, "This is not us." To the extent that it has been us, we don't want it to be us in the future, and we're going to take any steps that we can to make sure that we're the university that we aspire to be, and that's hopeful. As I've said before, I am an optimist, and so I do hope that even though we wish we were not in this particular historical moment in terms of a resurgence of white supremacy and new forms of white supremacist rhetoric, protest, social media fed ability to propagate it, I think that we are very much responding to it as a university, so it's good.
So Law School Dean Risa Goluboff and Brendan Nigro, member of the advisory, gotta make sure I'm saying it right, the Advisory Committee on the Future of the Historic Landscape. Thank you both for joining the Cavalier for this conversation. We appreciate it. And tomorrow we'll be doing a panel interview with several student leaders about how students responded to the events of August 11th and 12th, and sort of what's coming down the pipeline and what's ahead for this semester. So thank you both. We really appreciate it.